Night had settled heavily over the fjord long before midnight arrived. The sky above the frozen water held no movement now, only a pale scattering of distant stars that seemed fixed in the dark, as if winter itself had stilled them. Snow along the shoreline no longer drifted or shifted with the wind. It had hardened into quiet shapes against the earth, rounded and smooth, the way snow becomes when storms have already passed and the season has entered its long unbroken middle. Cold held the land in a steady grip. It pressed gently against timber walls, settled into the packed ground beneath them, and crept through every seam that separated the warm interior of a longhouse from the silent winter outside. There was no urgency in it. The cold did not rush or surge. It waited with patience that belonged to the long nights of the northern winter. Inside the hall, darkness moved differently. The roof beams stretched across the interior like dark ribs above a dim interior space where most light had already faded. No torches burned along the walls now. No bright flame reached upward toward the rafters. What remained instead was a low, steady glow at the center of the floor where the hearth lay, its ring of stone surrounding a quiet bed of coals that breathed faint warmth into the surrounding air. The glow did not flicker in tall flames. It pulsed softly beneath a thin covering of ash, red light moving slowly within the gray surface like a memory of fire rather than fire itself. Smoke drifted upward from that low bed of heat, thin and slow. It gathered beneath the roof for a moment before finding its path toward the opening above, where the night sky waited beyond the dark line of the beams. The air inside the hall carried the layered smell of wood smoke, wool, and old timber, warmed many times through the season. Across the packed earth floor, warmth spread outward in quiet gradients. Closest to the hearthstones, the air remained gentle against the skin, carrying the lingering heat stored in the coals. A few steps farther away, the warmth weakened slightly, fading into a cooler stillness that settled around the walls. Above it all, near the beams and smoke-darkened planks of the roof, colder air gathered and waited heavy and unmoving. The balance had held through many nights already. Deep winter had long since passed the moment when each snowfall felt new. By now the season had become something steadier. The storms had laid their layers over the land. The rivers had stiffened beneath ice, and the nights had grown so familiar in their length that darkness itself seemed like another structure of the longhouse, present, dependable, and expected. Within that dim interior space he lay close to the hearth, where the earth still held the memory of warmth from earlier hours. His cloak had been folded beneath him for extra padding against the hard ground, and a wool blanket lay across his shoulders, its thick weave carrying the faint scent of smoke from many evenings spent near the fire. One arm rested loosely across his chest, while the other lay nearer the hearthstones where the warmth reached most easily. For a long while there was no movement. The quiet of the hall remained complete except for the occasional soft shift of wood somewhere in the roof beams as the timber slowly adjusted to the cold pressing from outside. Even those sounds came rarely, spaced across the long silence like distant markers of time. The embers continued their slow breathing. Beneath the ash, pockets of red heat brightened for a moment, and then dimmed again as the air moved gently across the surface. Small fragments of charcoal cracked softly now and then, a quiet sound that barely reached beyond the ring of stones. It was enough to hold the warmth where it was needed. Most winter nights passed this way, the hearth settling into its quieter work after the evening fire had burned low. Bright flames belonged to earlier hours when food was cooked and voices carried across the hall. Midnight belonged to the embers, when the fire no longer demanded attention, but still offered the steady heat that kept the longhouse from surrendering to the cold outside. The arrangement worked because the embers did their work slowly. They released heat without hurry, allowing the warmth to remain close to the ground where bodies rested, where wool and leather gathered it, where the packed earth floor absorbed and returned it again in quiet exchange with the air. For a long time the balance held unchanged. Then, somewhere beneath the ash, the glow shifted, not suddenly and not with the sharp crack of a log collapsing into flame. The change was smaller than that. One patch of red dimmed slightly, where the coal beneath it had begun to settle deeper into gray dust. The warmth near the stone ring softened just enough that the air resting close to the ground lost a little of its weight. It was the sort of change that would pass unnoticed during the bright hours of day, but during the deep middle of winter, when the night stretched long and the fire had been entrusted to the embers alone, even a small change in their quiet breathing could be felt. Near the hearth, his eyes opened slowly. For a moment he did not move. The darkness inside the hall remained the same as it had been before sleep, the low glow of the coals still resting beneath their covering of ash. Yet something in the air felt slightly different against his face, a faint coolness where warmth had rested before. He shifted one arm closer to the stone ring and held his hand just above the ash-covered coals, feeling the air that rose from them. The embers were still alive, but their warmth had begun to thin, pushed upward with the gentle strength, pushed upward with the gentle strength that usually met his palm in the middle of the night. Instead, it drifted upward in softer threads, thin and uncertain, as though the heat stored in the coals had begun to loosen its hold on the surrounding air. He lowered his hand closer. The ash at the surface of the hearth lay undisturbed, a pale layer spread across the darker stones and charcoal beneath. It looked quiet and complete, as though the fire had already settled into its usual night form. But the glow beneath the gray surface revealed something different. Small points of red remained alive under the ash, yet they were scattered now, separated by thin pockets of cooling charcoal. He drew his hand back slowly and pushed himself upright. The movement was careful and unhurried, shaped by the stiffness that always followed hours of stillness on the packed floor. Wool shifted quietly against wool as his blanket slid from one shoulder and gathered in the crook of his elbow. The weight of it reminded him how cold the air beyond the hearth's reach could become during the deep hours of winter. For a moment he simply sat there beside the stones. His breathing settled into the quiet rhythm of the hall. Around him the Longhouse remained as it had been when sleep first took hold, dark, still, and patient. The walls held the faint warmth that had gathered there during the evening, and the roof beams rested in silence above the thin drift of smoke that moved slowly toward the vent opening high overhead. He leaned slightly closer to the hearth. The stones surrounding it held their warmth better than the coals themselves. When his fingers brushed one of the outer rocks, he could feel the stored heat beneath the surface, steady and reassuring. The stone had absorbed hours of warmth earlier in the night when the fire burned higher, and it released that heat now in a slower, more patient exchange with the air. This quiet exchange was what allowed the hearth to carry the Longhouse through the night. The fire did not need to remain bright for that to happen. Flames belonged to the early hours of darkness when wood was first laid across the hearth and sparks climbed upward through the hall. Those flames worked quickly, consuming the outer bark of the logs and breaking the wood into darker pieces of charcoal. By midnight, the fire was meant to change its nature. The larger flames faded long before the night reached its deepest stretch. What remained afterward were the embers, dense pieces of charcoal that held heat within their cores and released it slowly through the ash that settled across them. The ash itself became part of the work. Spread gently over the coals, it slowed the flow of air around them and kept their heat from escaping too quickly. It was a method shaped by long winters. Over the seasons, the practice had become quiet habit. Before sleeping, the evening fire would be drawn inward with a long stick, pulling the brightest coals together until they formed a single dense cluster at the center of the hearth. A thin blanket of ash would then be laid across the surface, not thick enough to smother the heat, but enough to soften its burning. Beneath that pale covering, the embers continued their slow work for hours. They did not blaze, they did not leap upward. Instead, they glowed steadily, breathing through the small channels of air that remained between them. Heat moved outward through the stone ring and across the floor where the warmth was needed most. The arrangement suited the longhouse well. Warm air always gathered low around the hearth first, spreading outward across the ground before rising slowly toward the darker space above. Those who slept near the fire felt its warmth through the earth beneath them and through the air resting just above the blankets. Farther from the hearth, the temperature dropped gradually but never so quickly that the cold of the night could settle into the hall. The embers made that balance possible. He shifted slightly closer, placing one knee on the packed ground near the stone ring. The earth there felt warmer than the air against his face. The difference was subtle but clear enough that his body recognized it without thought. His eyes moved slowly across the hearth. In several places, the ash had thinned enough for the red beneath to show faintly through. Those small glows marked where the heat still gathered, quiet pockets of warmth surrounded by darker charcoal that had begun to cool. When the embers were healthy, the glow beneath the ash usually appeared more even, a deeper red that moved in slow pulses across the entire surface. Tonight it seemed scattered. He reached toward the hearth again, this time with a short piece of wood that lay beside the stones. The stick had been used many times for the same purpose. Its tip had darkened and hardened from repeated contact with coals, and its surface carried the faint scent of smoke that never fully left objects kept near the fire. He lowered the end of the stick gently into the ash. The surface parted with little resistance, revealing darker charcoal beneath. For a moment the hidden glow brightened where the ash shifted aside, and a warmer breath of air rose against his hand. But the brightness faded quickly once the ash settled again. He paused. The stick rested lightly against the embers while he watched the faint red beneath the gray dust. There was still heat there, but the coals had begun to separate from one another. Small gaps had opened where pieces of charcoal had collapsed into softer ash. That was often how the embers weakened. As the charcoal burned slowly through the night, the pieces became lighter and more fragile. Their edges softened until they could no longer support their own weight. One by one they broke apart and sank deeper into the ash, leaving cooler spaces between the remaining coals. When those spaces grew too wide, the heat began to fade more quickly. He withdrew the stick and rested it across his knee. The longhouse remained quiet around him. Somewhere farther along the hall, a sleeper shifted slightly, wool brushing against the floor before stillness returned again. The sound faded quickly into the deep quiet that filled the space beneath the roof. His gaze returned to the hearth. Most nights the embers could be left undisturbed until morning. The ash covering them slowed the burn so effectively that the coals often remained alive long after dawn. But that quiet endurance depended on the embers remaining close together, each piece of charcoal sharing its heat with the others. Separated, they cooled faster. He leaned forward once more and held his hand above the ash. The warmth still reached his skin, though weaker now than when he first woke. It moved upward in thinner currents that faded quickly against the colder air of the hall. The difference was small enough that it would not trouble the sleepers yet, but it was there all the same. Winter nights allowed little room for neglect. The longhouse held warmth well, but the cold waiting outside never lost patience. If the hearth were allowed to fade too far, the air inside would begin to change slowly, almost unnoticed at first. The warmth near the floor would withdraw toward the stones, leaving the edges of the hall cooler with each passing hour. For now the balance remained. He lowered his hand again and watched the ash settle back into place across the embers. Beneath that pale surface, the remaining coals continued their quiet breathing, small pockets of red still alive within the deeper charcoal. He waited there beside them, listening to the slow rhythm of the hall and feeling the faint warmth rising against his palm as the night continued to pass. He remained beside the hearth for some time, his hand resting loosely on his knee while the other hovered near the stones. The warmth there continued to rise in slow currents, thin but steady enough that it carried the quiet presence of the fire through the darkness. The stick still lay across his lap. After a few breaths, he lifted it again and moved its end gently across the surface of the ash, not digging deeply but brushing lightly where the gray layer had grown uneven. The motion revealed several darker ridges beneath, charcoal that had settled together in narrow folds where the earlier fire had collapsed inward. For a moment the embers brightened. Where the ash shifted aside, faint red glowed through the broken charcoal, like small veins of warmth moving beneath a pale crust. The glow was not strong, but it was alive. Heat still moved there, passing slowly from one fragment of coal to the next. He watched it carefully. The embers had their own quiet pattern of life. When the fire burned brightly earlier in the evening, the wood had split and blackened, turning into dense pieces of charcoal that held heat deep within their cores. Once the flames faded, those pieces did not immediately lose their warmth. Instead, they began a slower process, releasing heat through their surfaces, while the interior remained hot for many hours. It was the ash that allowed this slow breathing to continue. As the charcoal burned, fine gray powder gathered across the surface of the hearth. That powder settled naturally over the coals, forming a thin barrier between the glowing heat and the air above it. With less air moving freely around them, the embers burned more slowly. Their heat stayed inside the cluster rather than rushing outward too quickly. The practice had been repeated through many winters. Before sleep, the coals would always be drawn close together, their brighter edges touching so that the heat of one strengthened the next. Then ash would be scattered gently across them, enough to soften the burn, but not enough to smother it completely. When the balance was right, the embers would continue glowing until the morning meal was prepared. He moved the stick again. The tip slid carefully through a narrow line in the ash where the charcoal had broken apart earlier. The movement revealed a deeper pocket of red beneath the surface, brighter than the scattered glow he had seen before. Warm air lifted from it immediately, brushing against his fingers. He paused there. That brighter place showed where several pieces of charcoal still rested close together. Their shared heat kept them alive longer, even while the surrounding coals cooled and settled into softer ash. But beyond that small cluster, the embers were growing thinner. He shifted slightly, bringing his other knee closer to the stone ring. The floor beneath him still held warmth from the earlier fire, but it felt different now than when he had first sat down. The earth released its heat more slowly than the embers themselves, yet even that quiet warmth had begun to soften. His gaze moved outward across the hearth. Several places along the edge of the coal bed had already darkened. Those pieces had burned through their remaining heat and broken apart into gray dust that held no glow at all. They would no longer take part in the slow work of warming the hall. The remaining embers were scattered between those cooler spaces. He lifted the stick once more and pressed gently against one of the darker pieces of charcoal. It crumbled easily, collapsing into soft powder that drifted across the surface of the hearth. The movement exposed another small glow beneath. For a few breaths the ember brightened where the air reached it. Then it dimmed again as the ash shifted back over the surface. He rested the stick across the stones. The quiet sound of charcoal settling faded quickly into the stillness of the hall. Above him, the smoke continued its slow path toward the opening in the roof, moving in a thin gray layer that barely shifted from one moment to the next. The air inside the longhouse changed only gradually when the embers weakened. It never happened suddenly. The heat stored in the stones and earth kept the cold from entering quickly. But once the embers began to separate, the warmth they produced could no longer travel as easily across the hearth. Small spaces of cooler air formed between the remaining coals, and those cooler pockets slowly widened as the charcoal burned down. He extended his hand again, holding it above one of those darker areas. The air there felt noticeably cooler than the place where the brighter embers rested. The difference was slight, but it was clear enough against the skin of his palm. He moved his hand back toward the glowing cluster and felt the warmth return. That difference, small though it was, revealed the shape of the hearth's changing heat. Where the embers remained close together, warmth still rose steadily. Where they had separated, the heat thinned and faded into the surrounding air. He watched the slow pattern for several moments. The embers continued their quiet work beneath the ash, each small glow marking a place where the charcoal still held life. Yet the spaces between them had begun to widen as the night deepened. He leaned forward again, resting one hand lightly on the nearest stone. The rock remained warm beneath his fingers, though its heat was gentler now than earlier in the night. That warmth would last for some time yet, slowly passing into the air around it even if the embers weakened further. Still, the stones alone could not carry the whole through the remaining hours of darkness. The coals needed to remain alive beneath the ash, close enough together that their heat could continue moving outward from the hearth. Without that steady glow, the warmth would retreat inward toward the stones, leaving the outer floor to cool little by little as the night continued. He drew the stick toward him once more. For a moment he held it loosely in his hand, studying the scattered glow across the hearth. The embers had not died, but they had begun to drift apart in quiet ways that only became clear when watched closely. The hall behind him remained silent. He sat there beside the hearth, the stick resting in his hand, while the dim red beneath the ash shifted gently in the darkness and the long winter night continued its slow passage outside the walls. For a while he did not move the stick again. The faint glow beneath the ash remained scattered across the hearth, small points of warmth separated by dull charcoal that had already surrendered its heat. He watched those scattered embers carefully, allowing his eyes to adjust to the subtle changes in their light. The longer he remained still, the easier it became to see how the heat was shifting. Near the center of the hearth, the embers still gathered in a loose cluster, their glow deeper than the others. The ash above them held a faint reddish tone where the warmth beneath pressed gently upward. But beyond that cluster, the surface of the hearth had begun to cool in wider patches, gray dust covering charcoal that no longer glowed at all. He lowered the stick again and touched the ash lightly. The surface parted in a narrow line, revealing a darker fragment of coal beneath. For a moment it brightened as the air reached it, releasing a thin breath of heat against his fingers. But the glow faded almost as quickly as it appeared. He drew the stick back slowly. The change was not sudden, yet it was clear enough now that the embers were no longer holding their heat evenly. The brighter cluster in the center remained alive, but the surrounding coals had weakened, leaving cooler spaces between them. He extended his hand over the hearth once more. The warmth that rose from the stones closest to the glowing coals was still strong enough to feel against his skin. But when he shifted his hand only a short distance outward, the air cooled noticeably. The difference formed a quiet boundary across the hearth, one side warm and steady, the other thinner and fading. That boundary had not been there earlier. When the embers lay closer together, their heat overlapped across the entire hearthbed. Even the outer edges of the charcoal held enough warmth to send a gentle breath of heat upward into the hall. Now the warmth had begun to draw inward. He sat back slightly on his heels. The movement of air above the hearth was changing as well. Earlier in the night, the warmth rising from the coals had carried smoke upward in a slow but steady column. The thin layer of gray beneath the roof had drifted gradually toward the vent opening above the center of the hall. Now that movement had softened. The smoke still rose, but more slowly. Without the same strength of heat beneath it, the air lifted in weaker currents that spread outward before they reached the beams above. The thin gray layer beneath the roof thickened slightly where the upward pull had slowed. He glanced upward. The smoke drifted quietly among the beams, gathering for a moment before finding its path toward the opening above. The movement remained steady enough that the hall did not fill with smoke, but the change was there all the same. Another small sign that the hearth was losing some of its strength. He lowered his gaze back to the coals. The cooler spaces along the edges of the hearth had begun to grow wider. Several pieces of charcoal that once glowed faintly had now turned fully gray, their heat spent. When the stick brushed one of them, it collapsed easily into powder. The sound was soft but clear. Charcoal breaking into ash always carried that same dry whisper, a brittle sound that faded quickly into the surrounding quiet. The hearth answered that sound with silence once more. He rested the stick across the stone ring. For a few breaths, he simply watched the remaining embers. Their glow was gentle, steady in the places where the charcoal still rested together. But the scattered pattern revealed how the heat was withdrawing slowly toward the center. The outer edge of the hearth now held little warmth of its own. That change would spread gradually if left alone. The packed earth floor around the hearth still carried warmth from earlier hours, yet that warmth depended on the steady breathing of the embers. When the coals weakened, the heat that once flowed outward across the floor began to retreat inward toward the stones. He shifted one foot slightly across the ground beside him. The earth close to the hearth felt comfortably warm through the wool beneath his leg, but when he moved his foot a little farther from the stone ring, the ground cooled noticeably. The difference was not sharp, but it was present enough that his body recognized it immediately. The warmth was shrinking. He drew his blanket tighter across his shoulders and leaned forward again, resting one elbow lightly on his knee while he studied the embers. In the deeper hours of winter night, the hall depended on that quiet bed of coals more than on any bright flame. The wood that burned earlier in the evening had already given most of its heat to the stones, the earth, and the air inside the longhouse. What remained now was the slower warmth stored inside the charcoal. If those embers faded too far, the cold outside would begin to press inward again, not quickly. The walls and roof held their warmth well, and the stones of the hearth released their stored heat for many hours. But the steady breathing of the embers was what kept the balance from shifting too far before morning. He lifted the stick once more and nudged the edge of the central cluster. The coals there still glowed brightly when disturbed. One fragment rolled gently against another, and the red beneath their surfaces brightened for a moment before settling again under the ash. Warm air rose against his hand. The heat remained strong in that small place, but just beyond it, the surface of the hearth had already cooled, the scattered charcoal no longer sharing its warmth with the cluster at the center. The embers had begun to drift apart. He watched the pattern quietly. The change had not yet spread far enough to disturb the sleepers behind him. The warmth near the hearthstone still reached the blankets and cloaks laid across the floor nearby. But the slow retreat of heat was beginning, and the deeper hours of the night still lay ahead. He rested the stick across his knee again. The embers continued their faint glow beneath the ash while the cooler spaces between them widened little by little, each quiet moment allowing the warmth of the hearth to draw slightly closer to its center. He remained kneeling beside the hearth while the embers continued their quiet settling. The glow beneath the ash shifted slowly as fragments of charcoal softened and collapsed inward. No sudden change announced the movement. It happened in small adjustments of light, one faint red patch dimming while another brightened briefly where the ash thinned. His eyes followed those changes carefully. The center of the hearth still carried the deepest warmth. When the coals touched one another, their heat gathered and held itself there, protected beneath the pale ash that covered them. But the spaces around that cluster had grown wider since he first woke, and the air rising from those places carried far less warmth. He extended his hand again and held it low above the hearth. The difference between one place and another was clearer now. Over the central cluster, the warmth lifted gently against his palm, a steady current of heat that rose from the stones and charcoal together. But a hand's width farther outward, the air cooled noticeably. He moved his hand slowly across the surface of the hearth, feeling the changing warmth as though tracing the shape of the embers beneath the ash. The heat was no longer spread evenly. It gathered in a smaller circle now, confined to the places where the charcoal still rested close together. Outside that circle, the air had begun to cool in quiet pockets. He sat back slightly and drew the blanket more firmly around his shoulders. The wool carried warmth from earlier hours, but even through its thickness he could feel the slow shift in the air around him. The heat that once spread easily across the floor had begun to draw inward toward the hearth. He shifted one knee across the ground. The packed earth beneath him still felt warm near the stones. The heat stored there rose slowly through the floor, released from the earlier fire that had burned strongly before the hall settled into sleep. But the farther he moved from the hearth, the cooler the ground became beneath the wool that covered his leg. The difference had grown more noticeable. It was not the sharp cold of the outside night. The hall still held its warmth well, yet the steady layer of heat that normally spread across the floor during the deeper hours had begun to thin. He leaned forward again and studied the embers. Several pieces of charcoal along the outer edge of the hearth had already turned pale. Their surfaces had softened until they crumbled when touched. Those fragments no longer held heat of their own. They had become nothing more than ash resting among the remaining coals. He reached for the stick again and nudged one of those pale pieces gently. It collapsed at once, breaking into powder that drifted across the surface of the hearth. The movement exposed a darker piece beneath it, and for a moment a dull red glow appeared where the air reached it. But the glow faded quickly, leaving the charcoal dark once more. He withdrew the stick and rested it across the stones. The quiet crackle of the collapsing charcoal faded into the stillness of the hall. Behind him the sleepers remained unmoving, wrapped in their cloaks and blankets near the warmth that still lingered close to the hearth. The longhouse breathed quietly around them, its walls holding back the deeper cold waiting outside. He turned his head slightly and glanced across the floor. The dim glow of the embers cast only the faintest light across the ground. Shapes lay scattered there, bundles of wool, cloaks folded beneath resting bodies, the low outline of wooden chests set against the wall. Closer to the hearth, the air still carried warmth, but farther into the hall, the darkness felt heavier, the air cooler where the fading embers no longer reached as easily. He returned his gaze to the hearth again. The central cluster continued to glow beneath the ash, yet the heat it produced was no longer spreading as widely as before. The cooler pockets around the edge had begun to form a ring where the charcoal had burned through its strength. He lowered his hand again, holding it above that cooler edge. The air there felt thin and quiet against his skin. No steady warmth lifted upward from those pale fragments of charcoal. Only the faint breath of heat from the center reached that far. He moved his hand inward again. The warmth returned at once, soft but steady where the embers still rested together. He sat with that difference for several breaths. It was always the same in the deeper hours of winter night. When the embers grew scattered, the warmth began to withdraw slowly toward their center. The floor near the hearth remained comfortable for some time, but beyond that space the cooler air gradually returned. If nothing were done, the circle of warmth would continue shrinking. The hall would not grow cold all at once. The stones still held heat, and the earth beneath them released it slowly into the air. But without the steady breath of the embers that stored warmth would fade little by little before morning arrived. He lifted the stick again and pressed lightly against the ash near the center cluster. The charcoal beneath shifted slightly when touched, revealing brighter red beneath its dark surface. A small breath of heat rose toward his hand, stronger than before. For a moment he left the stick resting there. The glow beneath the ash brightened where the charcoal moved closer together, their heat feeding one another again. But along the edges of the hearth, the cooler spaces remained. He drew the stick back slowly and watched the embers settle once more beneath the ash. The warmth at the center continued its quiet breathing, while the outer fragments of charcoal lay still and gray, no longer able to share in the heat that remained. Around him the longhouse rested in silence. The embers glowed faintly within their shrinking circle of warmth, while the cooler air of the hall waited patiently beyond it, pressing inward little by little as the night deepened. He remained beside the hearth, watching the quiet changes unfold across the coals. For several breaths he did not touch the embers again. Instead, he let his hand rest lightly on the nearest stone, while he studied the slow movement of air above the hearth. The warmth that rose from the coals no longer climbed with the same gentle strength it had earlier in the night. The difference was small, but it shaped the way the air moved through the hall. When the embers were strong, the warmth rising from them formed a steady upward pull that guided the smoke toward the roof opening. The thin gray layer beneath the beams drifted slowly in that direction, drawn along a quiet path that carried it out into the winter sky. Now that upward movement had softened. The smoke still lifted from the hearth, but it no longer rose in a clear column. Instead, it spread outward first, drifting beneath the roof beams in a slow widening layer before it gradually found its way toward the vent. He lifted his gaze toward the darker space above. The beams of the roof stretched across the hall like long shadows in the dim light of the embers. Between them, the smoke gathered in thin ribbons that moved only slightly from one breath of air to the next. It was not enough to trouble the air inside the hall. The opening above still allowed the smoke to escape, and the longhouse had been built with that slow movement in mind, but the change revealed how the hearth's quiet strength was beginning to fade. He lowered his eyes again. The embers beneath the ash continued their soft glow. Yet without the stronger heat pushing upward from them, the air inside the hall settled more heavily near the floor. He noticed it first against his face. The air close to the ground still carried warmth from the stones and the coals, but only a short distance higher it cooled more quickly. When he lifted his head slightly, he could feel that cooler layer resting above the warmer air near the hearth. He raised his hand slowly and held it midway between the floor and his chest. The warmth was weaker there. He lowered his hand again closer to the stones and felt the heat strengthen once more. The difference formed a quiet boundary inside the hall. Warm air lingered low where the hearth still breathed, while cooler air settled above it where the heat no longer reached as easily. This layering was part of the longhouse's quiet rhythm through winter. The fire warmed the ground and the bodies resting near it. That warmth rose slowly, but much of it remained close to the floor where wool blankets and cloaks held it in place. Above that layer, the air cooled more quickly, leaving the upper space beneath the roof darker and colder. The embers helped maintain that balance. As long as they breathed steadily, the warm air near the floor continued to renew itself. Even when the flames were gone, the quiet heat of the coals kept the lower part of the hall comfortable enough for sleep. But when the embers weakened, the movement of air slowed with them. He leaned forward slightly and held his hand above the center of the hearth again. The warmth still rose from that place, but its strength had softened further. It brushed against his skin rather than pressing firmly upward. He shifted his hand outward across the ash. Near the cooler edge of the hearth, the air barely moved at all. The heat there had thinned enough that the air no longer rose in steady currents. Instead, it lingered near the coals before drifting slowly outward across the floor. He drew his hand back and rested it against his knee. The quiet movement of smoke above him reflected the same change. Without the stronger warmth from below, the smoke gathered for longer moments beneath the roof beams before slipping gradually toward the opening. He watched that slow drifting for a time. The roof vent remained a dark shape against the night sky beyond, and through it the smoke escaped in thin gray threads that dissolved quickly into the cold outside. The hall itself remained calm. Nothing in the longhouse moved except the slow breathing of air and the faint settling of charcoal beneath the ash. Yet the subtle shift in warmth and airflow told its own quiet story. The hearth had begun to lose its balance. He leaned forward again, placing both hands on the stones for support as he studied the embers more closely. The cluster at the center still glowed faintly, but the cooler spaces around it had widened even further. The ash covering those places had grown pale and still, no longer stirred by the steady heat that once moved beneath it. He picked up the stick once more. For a moment he held it above the hearth without touching the coals, watching the faint red glow through the thin ash. Then he lowered the tip gently into the center cluster. The charcoal shifted when the stick touched it. A deeper glow appeared beneath the ash as several pieces rolled slightly against one another. Warm air lifted from the opening he had made, brushing against his knuckles with more strength than before. He left the stick resting there for a breath. The embers responded immediately to the movement. Their glow brightened where they gathered closer together, the heat building quietly as the charcoal shared warmth once more. But beyond that small place, the rest of the hearth remained quiet and gray. He withdrew the stick again and laid it across the stones. The glow beneath the ash dimmed slightly once the coals settled back into place. The warmth that had risen against his hand softened again, returning to the gentle breathing it had carried before. He sat back slowly. The air above the hearth continued its slow drifting movement, while the cooler spaces along the edges of the coals remained unchanged. The warmth of the fire still lived in the center, but the rest of the hearth had begun to fall silent. Around him the hall remained wrapped in the deep quiet of winter night. The sleepers behind him did not stir. The beams above held their shadows in place. Outside the walls the cold waited with the same patient stillness that had settled over the land since evening. Beside the hearth the embers breathed faintly beneath their covering of ash, while the air above them moved more slowly than before. For a few breaths he remained still beside the hearth, listening to the faint movement of air and the quiet settling of charcoal beneath the ash. The glow at the center of the coals continued its slow breathing, but the cooler edges of the hearth lay silent and gray. He reached for the stick again. The wood felt smooth in his hand from long use, its darkened tip carrying the faint scent of smoke that never fully left it. He held it above the hearth for a moment, studying the scattered pattern of embers beneath the ash. Then he lowered it gently. The tip touched the surface of the ash near the center cluster, pushing aside a thin layer of gray dust. Beneath it, the charcoal revealed its deeper red glow again, brighter now where the air reached it. He did not stir the coals quickly. Instead, he moved the stick slowly, drawing one small fragment of glowing charcoal closer to another. The two pieces touched lightly, and their shared heat brightened the red within them for a moment before settling again beneath the ash. Warm air lifted against his hand. He paused there, watching the faint glow deepen where the charcoal rested together. The embers responded quietly to the change, their warmth strengthening in that small place where the coals now touched. He shifted the stick again. Another fragment lay slightly apart from the cluster, its glow dimmer than the rest. He nudged it inward with a careful motion, guiding it across the ash until it settled beside the brighter coals. For a moment, the glow expanded across that part of the hearth. The charcoal pieces leaned gently against one another, their heat combining beneath the pale ash that covered them. The red beneath the surface grew steadier, less scattered than before. He withdrew the stick slightly and studied the result. The cluster had grown only a little larger, yet the warmth rising from it felt stronger against his skin. The coals now shared their heat more easily, allowing the slow breathing of the embers to deepen again. He moved the stick once more. This time he reached toward one of the darker edges of the hearth, where the charcoal had cooled earlier. A small fragment there still held a faint glow beneath the ash, though it had nearly faded into gray. He touched it carefully. The charcoal shifted with little resistance, sliding slowly across the surface of the hearth until it reached the edge of the brighter cluster. When it settled there, the dim red within it brightened slightly, fed by the warmth of the surrounding coals. He left the stick resting across the stones. For several breaths he watched the embers respond to the new arrangement. The glow beneath the ash no longer appeared as scattered points of red. Instead, it gathered into a tighter circle where the charcoal lay together again. The heat there rose more steadily now, brushing against his hand with quiet persistence. He held his palm low above the cluster to feel it. The warmth had strengthened, though it remained gentle and controlled beneath the ash. It lifted slowly through the cooler air above the hearth, carrying with it the faint smell of charcoal and smoke. He leaned slightly closer. The surface of the ash shifted in delicate patterns where the heat moved beneath it. In a few places, the gray dust cracked open in thin lines, revealing brighter red beneath before settling again. He reached for the stick once more. This time he did not disturb the center cluster. Instead, he moved the tip of the stick along the outer edge of the hearth, brushing aside small piles of ash that had gathered over the cooler charcoal. The ash slid easily across the stones. In a few places it revealed fragments of coal that still held a quiet glow beneath their dark surfaces. Those pieces had nearly disappeared beneath the powder, their heat fading under the weight of the ash. He nudged them gently inward. One by one the small fragments rolled toward the central cluster, joining the brighter coals already gathered there. Each time a piece settled among them, the red beneath the ash brightened slightly, the warmth growing more even across the hearth. He moved slowly, careful not to scatter the embers too widely. The stick traced quiet paths through the ash as he guided the charcoal into a closer circle. The motion produced only the faintest sound, the dry whisper of ash shifting across stone. Behind him the hall remained still. The sleepers did not stir, and the quiet breathing of the Longhouse continued undisturbed while the embers gathered themselves again at the center of the hearth. When he finished, he rested the stick across his knee. The glow beneath the ash now formed a single deeper patch of red rather than the scattered lights he had seen earlier. The warmth rising from it moved more steadily upward, brushing against his hand with renewed strength. He held his palm above the coals once more. The difference was clear. Where the embers had been scattered before, the heat had lifted in weak currents that faded quickly into the air of the hall. Now the warmth rose more evenly, spreading outward from the center of the hearth in quiet waves. He lowered his hand slowly. The stones near the coals began to absorb that warmth again, drawing it into their surfaces where it would remain long after the embers dimmed. He sat there beside the hearth, watching the newly gathered coals settle beneath the ash while their glow steadied and the warmth of the fire began its slow return. He remained beside the hearth after drawing the embers together, his hand resting lightly on the nearest stone while he watched the coals settle into their new shape. The glow beneath the ash had grown deeper where the charcoal now touched. It was not bright, but it carried a steadiness that had been missing before. The scattered points of red had gathered into a quieter center, a single low pulse of warmth that moved beneath the gray surface. For a few moments he allowed the embers to settle on their own. Charcoal always shifted slightly after being moved. The pieces leaned against one another and found new places of balance beneath the ash. Occasionally a fragment rolled softly into a deeper pocket, sending a brief breath of heat upward before the glow softened again. He kept his palm near the surface to feel those changes. The warmth rising from the center of the hearth had strengthened, though it still carried the gentle restraint that came from being covered with ash. It did not flare upward in quick bursts. Instead, it breathed slowly through the thin layer of dust, steady and patient. He lowered his hand and studied the outer edge of the hearth. Several fragments of charcoal there remained dark, their heat already spent. They had turned pale beneath the ash, brittle enough that a light touch reduced them to powder. Those pieces could no longer feed the embers gathered at the center. He reached for the stick again. The movement was small and unhurried. He guided the tip of the wood along the outer edge of the hearth, pushing the loose ash away from the brighter cluster. The pale dust slid easily across the stones, exposing darker charcoal beneath. Some of those fragments still held faint warmth. When the ash lifted away from them, a dull red glow appeared in their surfaces. It was weaker than the center cluster, but the heat remained alive inside them. He nudged those fragments gently inward. One by one they rolled across the surface of the hearth, guided by the stick until they touched the brighter coals. Each time a piece settled among them, the glow beneath the ash deepened slightly, the warmth spreading across a wider patch of charcoal. The cluster thickened slowly. He paused after each movement, allowing the embers to settle again before touching them once more. The stick traced quiet lines across the hearth, while the ash shifted in soft gray waves around the coals. A faint sound accompanied the movement. It was the dry whisper of charcoal brushing against stone and the quiet crumble of ash as it drifted aside. The sound was small enough that it did not travel far across the hall. He stopped when the cluster had grown dense again. The embers now lay closer together beneath the ash, their warmth shared across a compact bed of charcoal. The glow beneath the surface appeared steadier, no longer broken by the wide cooler spaces that had surrounded it earlier. He withdrew the stick and rested it across the stones. For several breaths he simply watched the embers. The heat beneath the ash moved slowly from one piece of charcoal to the next, strengthening where the coals leaned against one another. The glow shifted gently beneath the gray surface, forming a quiet heart of warmth at the center of the hearth. He held his hand above it once more. The warmth rose more clearly now. It reached his palm with a steadier presence than before, lifting through the cooler air in soft currents that drifted upward toward the roof beams. The air near the hearth carried the faint scent of charcoal and warm stone. He lowered his hand toward the ground beside the hearth. The packed earth beneath him had begun to gather that warmth again. The floor near the stones felt slightly warmer than it had earlier when the embers were scattered. The heat moved slowly outward from the hearth, spreading across the ground where the sleepers rested. He leaned back slightly on his heels. Behind him, the hall remained wrapped in darkness, but the quiet breath of warmth near the hearth had grown stronger. The cooler pockets of air that had begun to form earlier were already softening as the embers regained their strength. He looked once more at the surface of the ash. The thin gray layer had settled smoothly again across the coals. Only a faint reddish tone revealed the warmth beneath it, shifting gently as the charcoal continued its slow burn. He reached out with the stick one last time. From the small pile of wood set beside the hearth, he drew a slender piece no thicker than his thumb. It had been cut earlier in the evening from a larger log, saved for moments when the embers needed quiet feeding rather than a full fire. He placed the small piece across the center cluster. The wood rested lightly on the ash-covered coals. For a moment nothing changed. Then a faint glow appeared along the underside of the wood, where the heat touched it. He did not push it deeper into the embers. The small piece would warm slowly there, drying first before it began to burn. In time it would add new charcoal to the hearth without sending flames climbing into the hall. He laid the stick aside and watched the wood settle into place. The glow beneath the ash continued its steady breathing while the small piece of wood rested quietly across it. The warmth rising from the hearth moved gently against his hand and drifted outward across the floor once more. He remained there beside the stones, allowing the embers to reclaim their quiet balance while the deep winter night continued outside the longhouse walls. He remained beside the hearth after placing the small piece of wood across the embers. For several breaths, nothing changed. The wood rested quietly on the thin layer of ash, its pale surface dull in the low light of the coals beneath it. The warmth rising from the hearth moved slowly around it, touching the underside first, while the upper surface remained cool against the air of the hall. He kept his hand near the coals to feel the heat. The warmth continued to rise steadily now that the embers had been gathered together. It moved upward through the ash in soft currents that carried the scent of charcoal and warm stone. Gradually, the small piece of wood began to change. The underside darkened first where the heat reached it. A faint line appeared along the grain as the moisture inside the wood warmed and thinned. The change was quiet, visible only when watched closely. He leaned slightly closer to the hearth. The glow beneath the ash remained steady, pulsing gently around the charcoal cluster he had formed. The warmth from that cluster now spread outward more evenly across the hearth stones. He lowered his hand toward the ground beside him. The packed earth had begun to gather the returning warmth again. The heat from the stones passed slowly into the floor, moving outward beneath the blankets and cloaks resting nearby. The difference was small, but it was there. The cooler spaces that had begun forming earlier near the edges of the hearth were already softening. The air near the floor carried a gentler warmth once more. He sat quietly, letting the embers continue their work. The small piece of wood across the coals darkened further. The heat beneath it had begun to dry the outer fibers, turning the pale surface into a deeper shade of brown. In a few places, the wood released a faint curl of smoke that drifted upward before fading into the dim air of the hall. No flame appeared. The wood warmed slowly, exactly as it was meant to. The embers beneath it fed their heat into the grain little by little, allowing the piece to char without sending sparks into the room. He watched the slow change carefully. The smoke that rose from the wood moved upward, through the same quiet path the hearth had always formed. Though the embers were still gentle, the warmth beneath them had strengthened enough to guide the smoke toward the roof opening again. He lifted his gaze briefly. The thin gray layer beneath the beams had begun to drift more clearly toward the vent. The air above the hearth no longer lingered in the same heavy stillness it had earlier. The change was subtle, but it restored the slow rhythm the hall had carried before. He lowered his eyes back to the coals. The small piece of wood had begun to char along its underside. Dark lines spread gradually along the grain where the heat touched it. The surface did not break into flame, but it deepened in color as the warmth worked its way through the fibers. He reached out with the stick again. With a gentle motion, he nudged the wood slightly so that one end rested more firmly against the cluster of embers. The movement exposed a brighter patch of charcoal beneath the ash. The glow strengthened for a moment. Warm air rose against his hand again, steadier than before. The new piece of wood would soon begin to feed the embers, adding fresh charcoal once the outer surface burned through. He withdrew the stick and set it aside. For several breaths, he simply watched the hearth. The coals had regained their quiet balance. The glow beneath the ash spread across a compact cluster at the center of the stones, and the warmth rising from it moved outward through the air near the floor. Behind him, the sleepers remained undisturbed. Their cloaks and blankets rested in gentle folds across the packed earth where the warmth from the hearth could reach them. The slow breath of the embers passed beneath those layers of wool, keeping the air near the ground comfortable through the deep hours of the night. He shifted his weight slightly. The floor beside the hearth now felt warmer against his knee than it had earlier. The returning heat from the stones had begun to gather there again. He placed his hand briefly against the nearest stone. The surface carried the warmth of the coals beneath it, steady and reassuring. The stone absorbed that heat and released it slowly into the surrounding air, helping the hearth maintain its quiet work. He sat there for a long moment beside the fire. The embers glowed faintly beneath the ash, their warmth spreading outward once more while the small piece of wood darkened gradually where it rested across them. Around him the longhouse returned to its deeper stillness, the quiet breath of the hearth filling the hall while the winter night continued patiently beyond the walls. For a long moment he remained beside the hearth, watching the quiet rhythm of the embers. The small piece of wood resting across the coals had begun to darken more deeply along its underside. The heat beneath it continued its slow work, turning the outer fibers into a thin layer of charcoal that would soon join the cluster below. The glow beneath the ash remained steady. Where the charcoal lay together, the warmth moved gently through the hearth stones and across the floor, spreading outward in soft currents that reached the blankets and cloaks nearby. He lifted his hand once more and held it above the coals. The air that touched his palm now carried a more stable warmth than it had earlier. It rose slowly but with quiet persistence, drifting upward toward the beams before fading into the cooler air above. He lowered his hand again. The balance inside the longhouse had begun to settle. The smoke drifting from the hearth followed a clearer path toward the roof opening once more. Thin threads of gray lifted upward through the dim interior, drawn gently toward the dark square of sky above the hall. He glanced upward briefly. The beams remained still in the dim glow of the embers. Smoke passed between them in quiet layers, never thick enough to linger for long before slipping through the opening. The slow breath of air through the hall had returned to its familiar rhythm. He turned his attention back to the hearth. The embers beneath the ash continued their patient burning. Small shifts of light moved beneath the gray surface as the charcoal settled against one another, each piece feeding warmth into the cluster. The small piece of wood had now begun to char along its lower edge. Its surface darkened where the heat reached it, and a faint line of smoke rose from the wood before dissolving into the air. The change remained slow and controlled, exactly as it should be when feeding the embers through the night. He leaned forward slightly. With the stick, he nudged the wood once more, not enough to break the surface of the coals, but just enough to settle the charred side more firmly against the glowing charcoal. The wood shifted softly. The movement exposed a brighter patch of embers beneath it, and for a moment the glow deepened where the charcoal met fresh air. Warmth lifted against his knuckles again. He withdrew the stick and rested it along the stones. The embers quickly returned to their steady breathing beneath the ash. The glow softened again once the charcoal settled back into place, though the warmth rising from the cluster remained stronger than before. He watched the hearth for a few quiet breaths. The air near the floor felt comfortable now, the earlier coolness fading as the embers regained their strength. The warmth moved slowly outward across the ground, passing beneath the sleeping bodies nearby. He leaned back slightly from the hearth. The floor beneath him still carried heat from the stones, and the blanket around his shoulders held that warmth close to his body. For a moment he listened. The hall answered with silence. No one stirred among the sleepers behind him. The quiet sounds of winter beyond the walls remained distant and faint. Even the embers made little noise now, their burning too slow to crack or spark. He placed his hand once more against the stone ring. The surface felt steadily warm, the heat passing through the stone in quiet exchange with the air around it. That warmth would remain there for many hours, long after the glow of the coals softened again. Satisfied with the hearth's balance, he lowered the stick beside the stones. The embers had been gathered, the new wood had begun its slow charring, and the warmth had returned to its steady rhythm. He remained there beside the hearth for another quiet moment, allowing the glow beneath the ash to settle fully into its renewed calm. The small piece of wood continued to darken slowly as it absorbed the heat beneath it, and the steady breath of warmth moved outward across the floor of the longhouse once more. He remained beside the hearth a little longer, letting the quiet steadiness of the embers settle fully into place. The small piece of wood resting across the coals had darkened along most of its underside now. The heat beneath it had worked patiently through the grain, turning the outer layer into charcoal that would soon blend with the cluster below. The glow beneath the ash remained low but dependable. It did not spread widely across the hearth, nor did it need to. The coals lay close enough together that their warmth rose steadily through the thin layer of ash and into the air just above the stones. He held his hand above them once more. The warmth lifted gently against his palm, steady and calm. It was no longer the thin, uncertain heat he had felt earlier when the embers had begun to separate. Now it moved upward in slow currents that carried quiet strength with them. After a moment he lowered his hand again. The floor beside the hearth had grown warmer as well. The packed earth had absorbed the returning heat and released it slowly beneath the blankets and cloaks nearby. He shifted his weight and eased back from the stones. The movement was slow, careful not to disturb the quiet balance that had settled across the hall. His knee lifted from the warmed ground, and he drew the blanket more securely around his shoulders as he leaned away from the hearth. The embers continued their work without his touch. He reached for the stick once more, not to move the coals again, but simply to draw the ash lightly across the surface of the cluster. With a gentle motion, he smoothed the gray layer over the glowing charcoal. The ash settled softly. Its thin covering would help slow the burn again, keeping the embers alive through the remaining hours of darkness. Beneath it, the glow softened, though the warmth rising from the coals remained steady. He laid the stick down beside the stones. For a moment he remained crouched near the hearth, watching the pale ash shift slightly where the heat moved beneath it. The surface no longer showed scattered glows as it had earlier. Now the red beneath appeared only in faint pulses, where the charcoal leaned together under the ash. The small piece of wood rested quietly across the cluster. Soon it would break down into new charcoal, feeding the embers without sending flames through the hall. For now it remained still, its darkened underside absorbing the warmth rising from the coals. He glanced once more toward the roof. The smoke above the hearth drifted upward in thin strands that disappeared through the opening high above the beams. The air inside the longhouse moved slowly but steadily again. The balance had returned. He shifted backward across the floor. The ground near the hearth still held its warmth, and the wool beneath him softened the hardness of the earth as he moved. His blanket trailed lightly behind him while he eased himself back toward the place where he had rested earlier. The embers remained within his sight. Even from a short distance away, he could see the faint reddish tone beneath the ash that marked their quiet life. The glow was gentle, no brighter than before, but it carried the calm steadiness that would hold the warmth in the hall through the rest of the night. He lowered himself onto the blanket. The wool settled beneath him with a soft shift of fabric, holding the warmth gathered near the hearth. He drew the blanket closer around his shoulders and stretched his legs slowly across the ground. The air near the floor remained comfortably warm. The heat from the stones and coals spread outward in a quiet circle around the hearth, just as it had earlier in the night before the embers had begun to scatter. He turned his head slightly toward the fire. The ash-covered coals rested silently within the stone ring, their glow faint beneath the pale surface. Only the smallest movements of light showed where the heat still moved beneath the ash. He watched them for a moment longer. The hall remained still around him. The sleepers nearby did not stir, and the slow breath of smoke continued its gentle rise toward the roof vent. Gradually his body relaxed against the warmed ground. The embers no longer required his attention. Their quiet work had resumed steady and patient beneath the ash, holding the warmth of the longhouse while the winter night continued outside the timber walls. He lay quietly where he had settled beside the hearth, the blanket gathered around his shoulders and the warmth of the floor moving slowly through the wool beneath him. For a while his eyes remained open. The stone ring of the hearth rested a short distance away, its shape only faintly visible in the dim glow that lingered beneath the thin covering of ash. The light was low enough that it no longer reached the walls of the hall, but it held a small circle of gentle warmth near the ground. The small piece of wood across the coals had darkened further. Beneath the ash it had begun its slow change into charcoal, feeding the quiet life of the hearth without any bright flare of flame. He watched it for a moment longer. The glow beneath the pale surface moved almost too slowly to see, shifting only when a small piece of charcoal settled deeper among the others. Each change released a breath of warmth that drifted upward before fading into the cooler air above. After a time, his eyes closed. The longhouse held its stillness around him. The sleepers nearby remained motionless beneath their blankets. The low shapes of their resting bodies formed quiet outlines across the floor where the warmth of the hearth reached them. No voice disturbed the night inside the hall. His breathing settled into a slow rhythm. Each breath moved easily through the warm air near the ground, rising and falling without hurry. The blanket around his shoulders softened with each small shift of his chest, its heavy weave holding the warmth that had gathered through the night. Outside the walls, the winter darkness remained deep and patient. The cold pressed gently against the timber boards of the longhouse, finding no quick path inside. Snow rested along the edges of the roof where earlier storms had left their weight, packed now into quiet shapes that did not move. Within the hall, the warmth remained close to the earth. The hearthstones released their stored heat slowly, passing it outward into the floor and the air near the sleepers. Beneath the ash, the embers continued their quiet work, their glow hidden but alive within the cluster of charcoal. The small piece of wood settled slightly as the heat worked through it. A faint thread of smoke lifted from the place where it touched the coals, drifting upward through the dim space of the hall before dissolving into the darker air near the beams. The movement was slow enough that it seemed almost still. He shifted once beneath the blanket. The motion was small, only enough to ease his shoulder more comfortably against the ground. The wool folded softly around him again as he settled. His breathing remained steady. The warmth beneath the blanket lingered along the floor where the hearthstones continued releasing their heat. It spread outward in a quiet circle that held the nearest sleepers in comfort through the deeper hours of the night. The embers beneath the ash gave no sound. Their burning was too slow for the sharp cracks of flame or the sudden collapse of wood. Instead, they worked silently. the charcoal leaning gently against one another as the heat moved through them. Above them, the air remained calm. The thin smoke rising from the hearth slipped quietly between the beams before finding its way through the roof opening. Outside, the cold sky waited without movement, swallowing the faint gray threads as they drifted upward. Inside the longhouse, nothing hurried. The night moved at its own slow pace, marked only by the quiet rise and fall of breathing among those who slept near the hearth. He rested there without stirring. The warmth beneath him remained steady, held between the stones of the hearth and the heavy wool that covered him. The deeper cold above lingered near the roof beams, where it could not reach the sleepers gathered near the ground. Time passed quietly in that stillness. The small piece of wood across the coals darkened a little more, its edges slowly softening into new charcoal. Beneath it, the embers continued their quiet glow, sharing their heat through the cluster he had gathered earlier. The hall remained wrapped in calm. The timber walls held back the winter outside. The floor carried the warmth of the hearth. The sleepers rested in silence beneath their blankets. He remained among them, breathing slowly beside the fire. And through the deep hours of the winter night, the quiet warmth of the embers endured.